And I'd like to talk about some stories I heard from a woman the second year of my Baha'i life, 1972. I lived in San Luis Obispo, California. And someone said, well, there's a woman in Carmel who met Abdu'l-Bahá. Really? So I went up to Carmel, and I was sitting on her front porch when she came back from the store. Did you meet Abdu'l-Bahá? Oh, yes, I did. Come in. And so she said, you know, that's not the important thing. Abdu'l-Bahá didn't only come to this world for the people who met him. He came for everyone. And in fact, if you read his tablet of visitation, he says, whoever recites this tablet with lowliness and fervor, it will be as meeting him face to face. So that was the first thing she said, which was a sign of her humility. She was a wonderful, wonderful lady. Inez cook at the time of her 1920 pilgrimage, and Inez Greeven, she married Max Greeven, a wonderful American pioneer in Germany, I believe in the 1930s. So this was when she was in her 80s, and she had very clear memories of her pilgrimage. And marvelous, marvelous things happened on her pilgrimage. Mrs. Greeven lived in a hotel in New York City, and I believe she said it was in 1919 that she was on her bed resting in her hotel room in New York City. She said, I was quite awake, and the room changed, and Abdu'l-Bahá walked in, and he greeted her, and he placed his hand on her and said, all the spiritual susceptibilities of man are centered here. She said the room looked different. The floor wasn't carpeted. It was a stone floor, and there was an archway above the window. It had a Mediterranean feel to it. And then he was gone, and it was her hotel room again. And this was, I believe, about a year before her pilgrimage. When she arrived in the Holy Land, and they came to the Master's house, he met them individually rather than as a group. Each believer sat in one of the small rooms around the great room in the Master's home with a translator, and he went from room to room and greeted each pilgrim individually. And Inez was sitting in one of those rooms. She was seated on one bed, and the Master's daughter, Tuba Hanum, was seated on the other bed, and she would act as her translator. Suddenly the door opened and the Master walked in, and it was the fulfillment of her earlier vision. The Master came in and greeted his daughter, and then he placed his hand on Inez and said, all the spiritual susceptibilities of man are centered here. And this was the beginning of her extraordinary pilgrimage. She said that Abdu'l-Bahá was the funniest man I ever met. And she said that he would eat before lunchtime, and then he would serve us lunch. And he would tell us to start eating. And as we were eating, he walked around the table, and he began to teach us. And she said he spoke with such depth and beauty. She said, I was so filled with spirit, I couldn't bear to hear another word. And she said he stopped, and he moved his cap slightly, and he began walking around and telling jokes. She said he was hysterical. We were falling out of our chairs. She said our sides hurt. We were laughing so hard. I couldn't stand it anymore. She said, and then he stopped and he moved his cap back, and he returned to deepening the friends, and that this was his rhythm. And Marcia Gale, in one of her books, writes that the Master had a humorous angle to his cap, and that he would move his cap in a certain way and then tell funny stories. She said that occasionally he would use a few English words with her, and that there was a particular happiness in her heart whenever he spoke in English. And so she told him, it makes me very, very happy when you speak in English. And he said, very well, I will speak English to you. So she was staying in the Pilgrim House at number 4 Haparsim, across the street from the Master's house. And she came out of the Pilgrim House, and the Master was in his front yard watching the sunset. And he saw her, and he said, good evening. Good heavens. Good stars. Good night. At that same pilgrim house, something very important occurred. Among the friends on that pilgrimage were Florian and Grace Krug. Dr. Krug was quite wealthy. He was a surgeon, and they owned a hospital. And they paid the passage for a number of the friends who came on that pilgrimage, including a woman named Ruth White, who a short time later broke the covenant. She was unbalanced. And so Mrs. Krug, a wealthy woman, dressed very nicely. And so the friends were gathered in the pilgrim house at number 4. And Mrs. Krug came rushing in one evening and said, "Friends, my pearl necklace has come unstrung, and the pearls have scattered in the bushes. Please come outside and help me find my pearls before it gets dark." And Ruth White said, "That'll teach you. You shouldn't have pearls. You should dress simply like I do." And she's saying this to this generous woman who has paid her passage and all of her expenses for pilgrimage. And the friends took sides. And the friends started arguing about whether it was all right to have pearls. Well, nice things are all right as long as you don't let them come in between you and God. Well, but does it have to be real pearls? And Inez couldn't stand it, this conflict in these holy surroundings on the mountain of God. And she went outside and she sat down on the porch. You know, there's a famous verse in the gospel where Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Inez was sitting on the porch weeping, and Abdu'l-Bahá would come over during the day. For a break from his work writing tablets, he would come over and visit the pilgrims. And he came walking through the gate, came up the stairs, and there on the front porch was Inez sitting there crying. "Why are you crying, my daughter?" "Well, Abdu'l-Bahá, the believers are arguing, and it's so painful. I can't stand the conflict." And Abdu'l-Bahá said, "You have to go back inside and unite the friends. Be the peacemaker." And she said, I stopped crying. This stopped me from crying. And I told Abdu'l-Bahá, "My mom died when I was very young, and I was raised by my grandmother. And many times, my grandmother read that verse from the gospel to me, 'Blessed are the peacemakers.'" And Abdu'l-Bahá said, "Yes, I know. And for those words alone, your grandmother is today enjoying the kingdom of heaven." So that's the station of sharing a divine verse with a child. One day the master said to her, Inez was with her sister, and the master said, "Where's your husband?" And this was the one question she didn't want to discuss. She said, well, Abdu'l-Bahá, he's not here. "I can see that he's not here. Where's your husband?" "Well, Abdu'l-Bahá, he left me for another woman." "Yes, I know. And because you have forgiven him, God has forgiven him." Very powerful insight into the dynamics of the spiritual world. Mm-hmm. Later, she had a wonderful marriage with Max Greeven, and their photo is seen in the letters of Shoghi Effendi to the Benelux countries, as they spent some time in those countries. Wonderful souls. She was very proud of the fact that the Guardian had written to those believers when they were holding their convention that it was his hope that Max Greeven would be elected to the National Spiritual Assembly. He recognized that that community needed that man's strength at that early stage.